Good afternoon. My name is Dawn Numdu. I am your host for today, and welcome to the Agricultural Development Agency webinar focused on the impact of the energy crisis on South African agriculture. Now, this event is being hosted in partnership with Food For Mzansi, and I know that many of you are listening via our website, which is www.foodformzansi.co.za, and of course via our Facebook page and our YouTube channel at Food For Mzansi. And thank you so much for being here. We hope that today will be fruitful and that you'll get the most out of the discussion. Now, I think this topic really needs little to no introduction. If you're a South African citizen, you're very familiar with our ongoing energy crisis and rolling blackouts, and President Cyril Ramaphosa's declaration of a state of disaster to try and deal with the crippling and unprecedented energy crisis. Now, we cannot ignore the harsh reality that Eskom's power cuts are having on our farmers. You deal with it day to day, everyone listening, we are very much aware of what's happening. Crops are failing, livestock is suffering, and businesses are struggling to survive. Now today, with my guest, I hope that we'll come up with some of the technology solutions. AGDA has committed to finding the solutions to this crisis, and it believes that technology has the potential to revolutionize agriculture in Mzansi and mitigate the impact of the energy crisis. Now, to everyone who's listening, this is not just a little, another webinar that we're going to have today. This is definitely a call to action, and we hope that by the end of the discussion, you will be aware of your role and how you can contribute and how we can come up with solutions for this crisis. We have a number of experts in the room, and of course the farmers. We hope to engage with you as well on this platform, but also afterwards. I'd like to now welcome my guest. I have with me Theo Boshoff, who is the Chief Executive Officer at AgBiz. Thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you.
And then I also have Mike Levington, who is the CEO of Hydrogen Energy. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm happy to be here.
Now, I want to read your bios, but I don't know if that's necessary. Must I give a little bit of information? Maybe you can tell us as a start, maybe just a little bit about what you do.
Okay.
As we start the conversation, and then we'll take it from there.
Do you want to start, CEO?
Right, please go ahead, Mike.
So, my name is Mike Levington. I am the CEO of Hydrogen Energy. I also am the CEO of a solar PV development company called Kabi Solar. In my past, I was one of the founder members and for a number of years, the deputy chair of the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association, which represents the solar PV industry in interaction with government, really trying to promote solar PV. I'm also the deputy chair of the Busa Energy Subcommittee, so I get to hear a lot of the struggles that not only the farming sector, but all sectors are facing with the energy crisis. And I'm also kind of a NEDLAC Energy Task Team member. So I get involved in those, let's call it social partner interactions, okay, that's trying to address the energy crisis in South Africa.
Thank you so much for being here. I definitely have the right people in the room.
Well, maybe.
Theo, I think you really need no introduction, but maybe just for maybe for those that don't know you, a bit of your journey in agriculture and also just your contribution to this conversation.
Yes, no, thanks so much, Mike and Dawn, for being in. Also, afternoon to everyone listening. So my name is Theo Boshoff, CEO of the Agricultural Business Chamber, AgBiz. It's, for those that don't know, it's an industry association representing roughly just over 100 agri-businesses as well as commodity associations across South Africa. So we focus mostly policy and legislation, also work very closely with Mike, in the Busa Economic Policy Committee and all of these sort of issues. But I think the relevance probably for this conversation more recently is we were asked to lead the energy sort of response task team by Minister Didiza, Minister of Agriculture, at the beginning of this year when the crisis sort of started to hit. So our focus was mostly on kind of adaptation measures and trying to figure out ways in which the agricultural sector can kind of buffer themselves or at least ride out the current energy challenges.
Now, as a start, in the Southern African agricultural sector, where is energy most required? I'd just like to maybe give a broad overview for the context of the conversation. If you can just talk about specifically for developing and small to medium farming enterprises within Southern Africa. Mike, would you like to start?
Ooh, I think that's probably one that's very, Theo could probably answer much more expertly than I do, but if you start there, then I'll chip in afterwards.
Okay, Theo, maybe you should go.
No problem. This is actually quite an important thing, and if I can expand it a little bit, when we started with this task team and the minister called us together in January, the first thing that I think they wanted to know from cabinet side as well is, what's the impact going to be on food security when we reach we hit this in level 5, level 6. So with assistance, of BFAB and the expert researchers, we also sent out sort of an industry-wide questionnaire to try to find out what the impact is, who can mitigate, who can't mitigate, what are the kind of intensive energy users. And as it comes out, I think especially for primary agriculture, there's a couple of industries that have got very sort of peak and trough kind of demand, but quite high demand, specifically irrigation. Smallholder, medium, as well as large scale on irrigation schemes, as well as those obviously irrigating out of boreholes. And these are, I think spread right throughout South Africa, but obviously in the different areas across South Africa. You also got relatively energy-intensive agricultural operations, which unfortunately is not peak and trough, which makes it a little bit more difficult to manage and not as concentrated. The likes of dairy, where of course, you need to cows need to be milked 3 times a day. It immediately needs to be cooled down for the food safety elements. The likes of aquaculture, for instance, there's a number of these that require constant energy supply. Going then up in the value chain, I think that's also very important to understand. So many commodities, whether it's fruit, whether it's dairy, whether it's meat, relies on an uninterrupted cold chain. So going up the value chain, you immediately start thinking of cold storage, for instance. Then you've got the processing side, and these are typically quite embedded in small towns in municipal grids, the likes of soybean crushers, silo storage complexes, for instance, the processing side of it as well, millers, etc. Even on the input side, the animal manufacturers, the packaging manufacturers. So looking at the whole value chain, it really is quite widespread. And I can maybe just say, the biggest impact at the moment, and when we did this survey, it does seem that most, on a macro scale, not on a micro scale, because of course there are many producers for financial other reasons that simply don't have an alternative. But most people through diesel generators, etc., are managing to survive in terms of that. We didn't foresee, except for a couple of isolated instances, for instance, with packaging, there wasn't enough packaging that we had to import some. But for the most part, the production managed to carry on, but it's got a huge cost impact. Running diesel generators, obviously, that through that knock-on effect then up the value chain, eventually ending up with consumers. So the food security risk really is sort of impacted, I think, mostly in the price of food and contributing to that food price inflation.
Yeah, just on a point, Michael, give you a chance now.
Okay.
One of the farmers that we spoke to before the discussion was Roland Trout. He's a farmer from the West Coast in the Western Cape, and he farms with pigs and protea flowers. And he said that when it comes to load shedding, it always happens to be with the cold chain and that element of it. And so that's often overlooked. People talk about, hands-on farming, what's happening on farm level, but there's so many other aspects. And I think, Mike, you wanted to specifically focus on that.
Yes, I think maybe to add to what Theo said, I think one of the complaints that came through to me when talking to some of the other sectors was the unpredictability of when load shedding was going to happen on a daily basis. And I think particularly for the farming sectors that use those big pivot farms, suddenly you're being load shed between 10 and 12, or sometimes you're being load shed for 6 hours. Okay, and it makes it almost impossible to manage your irrigation process. And as I say, it kind of then goes up the food, up the chain to, and I've heard this more from, say, the commercial property sector, but I'm sure it affects farms the same, is that, yes, maybe from even, 5-10 years ago, farmers may have put in diesel generators, but you only ever intended it and been told to expect to use it for, a very small amount of time.
Yes.
And now you're suddenly finding you're having to use it every day. That has a huge impact, in terms of your fuel bill, and it's now become unsustainable. Firstly, I suspect many of those generators are operating, as Eskom does with theirs, outside of their, they're only meant to be operating so many hours a day, or so many hours a year. And then, of course, you've got the primary energy cost of fuel. So I think for a lot of sectors, if you're saying, right, I have to take a view on how long will it take for load shedding to end.
Yes.
Do I listen that it's going to end in 18 months? or do I think it's going to be 10 years? Because ultimately, if you're going to go and buy a new generator or go into putting solar PV, you kind of want to make sure that it's actually worthwhile doing. Okay, so part of, I think it's important is that, government gives us a far more sort of honest and a frank view on how long it's going to take and how we're going to solve it. Because then I think it allows people to kind of manage their days and manage their future in a far more predictable and informed way.
And that's hopefully where Theo and the rest of the task team comes in, to be able to put those steps in place and to have this outlook further along the timeline.
Indeed.
So all the best with that work, Theo. Now, we've had this conversation numerous times, perhaps not with people in this room, but people have spoken about the issues. And agriculture, as I said before, is affected, but it's also being affected globally. So it's not just here, it's not just our context in this country. And it's not just the climate crisis, but it's also the energy crisis. Now, if either of you could solve this problem, what would you sort of focus on specifically? I think Theo started first, so Mike, I'm going to give this one. Let's see what Mike's
Let me see if I can be controversial on this one. I would say one of the things we've only woken up to in probably the last 2 years in South Africa. If you notice, whenever we've had energy debates or electricity debates, we've always focused on typically what generation technology we're using, okay, and to some extent whether it's coal, whether it's renewables, which is actually a kind of bit of a moot argument. I think what unfortunately that has done is it meant that we have actually ignored where the real problem lies, which is the grid, okay, and this is not a South African unique to South Africa, okay, so around the world, and you've got to remember there are many other countries who are transitioning their energy to renewables and lower carbon technologies, and are finding that you can never build the grid fast enough to meet the appetite of the generation that wants to connect. And we're having to make that fundamental change from, in the past, of big coal-fired plants in one spot and then essentially transmitting that power over thousands of kilometres, to the future energy sector where you've got lots of smaller generators, micro generators, in a much more dispersed fashion. Okay, so you fundamentally need to change the grid to be able to satisfy that. Okay, and it involves public sector and private sector working together to make that happen. That doesn't solve your problem in the short term, but if you don't have that, if you don't make that part of your medium to long term solution, and I think particularly for farmers, that you tend to be in many cases on the end of some probably 33 or 11 kV lines, with maybe 5 or 10 farmers on it, so your supply is typically not very clean. Okay, and that then talks to, do I put generation at one end? How do I look at using battery storage? Do I look at microgrids? And those are the areas, as farmers, I'd be looking at. Understanding the way that we've changed legislation. So we've now made it possible for, self-generation to be done in a far more simple way in terms of registration rather than licensing. So the legislation has been changed. It's really about farmers, all kinds of business owners, being able to do the sums ultimately, because in the end it has to make sense from a rand and cents perspective of how much do they take control, okay, of managing now what's becoming a very key aspect of your business.
Yeah, no, definitely. Now, I mean, we can obviously touch on how we can unpack this and also timelines. Sure. And how do we get the necessary people to be able to address what you're saying and making that work in the long term. But maybe, Theo, your thoughts on this and what Mike is saying specifically. Do you agree that that's the best approach, and what would your approach be?
Yeah, no, definitely. So no disagreement. But I think maybe, the approach that sort of we're following is slightly different, simply in the sense that sort of Mike and the energy experts, they're trying to find a cure for the problem. We're just trying to treat the symptoms at the moment.
Why would you put a Band-Aid on it? Mike will come and rip it up later.
No. But it's equally important. I mean, for instance, we had the situation I say January this year is a good example. There was persistent stage 5, stage 6 load shedding. We had a terrible heat wave with sort of 3 weeks without a drop of rain. Now you can imagine, as you mentioned, getting the center pivots going, you need to pump from the source. You need to get it to a holding, sort of a holding dam. From there, you can only start irrigating. So you need hours, a certain amount of hours of uninterrupted power. So not just hours in a 24-hour sort of period, uninterrupted power. So ultimately, what it comes down to is predictability. Trying to get load shedding a little bit more predictable. So in primary agriculture, what we've tried to do, and as I mentioned, BFAB helped quite well to do this mapping exercise to see where are the irrigation hotspots in South Africa. And what I mean by that is where can you almost make the assumption that 60, 70, 80% of customers on a substation is irrigation farmers. They would all have very, very similar kind of energy needs. And then potentially, if you can get the buy-in of all of them, one can approach Eskom, and these are discussions we've had to say, can we not switch over to having at least a guaranteed 8 hours overnight when obviously evaporation's less, and then we'll forgo some electricity for a longer period during the day. The challenge comes in and becomes very complicated where you've got other users on the same grid. Households, communities, businesses that obviously operate during normal business hours. It becomes very difficult, because there's no... I think the situation's often been compared to COVID to say, can't you declare sort of agriculture as an essential sector? But unfortunately, there's no... you can't go to a megawatt park and there's a big circuit box where you go agriculture on and off. It's, that's not the case. It differs based on the grid from area to area. So the discussions we've had, obviously that for the irrigation farmers. In the agribusiness is also, I think, is quite a challenge. If you look at productivity, if you have a lot of agro-industrial clients, processors especially, they work 24 hours with 3 8-hour shifts. If you have energy interruptions during a shift, you obviously lose productivity. But in extreme examples, for instance, with abattoirs or chicken processing facilities, it's a biosecurity risk. If your power goes out, you have to throw everything away. It's huge food wastage. So these are the sort of real examples that we're trying to find workable solutions. Now, again, having either load curtailment, where you don't get load shed, but you voluntarily reduce your energy consumption by 5% for each stage of load shedding. So you determine yourself what is vital, what is not vital. So you can, adjust your output accordingly. That's, the one good option. And the other option, obviously, is having these shifts. So say having, 2 8-hour shifts with power, we'll forgo 1 8-hour shift without power. We can do cleaning and, other sort of non-intensive things. So that's a discussion. It is a band-aid approach, but just the urgency, I think, is really it also merits it to try to get these discussions going. Once again, it is a challenge, especially where you are tied on the grid with other users that don't have the same energy needs as you have. So what we're currently underway, again, the STARS team consisting of farming organizations, BFAB, government, NAMC, and ourselves. We've now agreed with Eskom to identify a number of different pilot projects, areas, so a farmers district that will pilot an irrigation district, some agri-businesses that are either grid tied or those that are investing to try, in their own line to the substation so that they can actually be, not tied to, or their schedules can be different from their neighbors. These are the sort of real problems, I think, that we're trying to find makeshift solutions for, but really it's a band-aid approach at the moment.
Yeah, and Mike, you can probably give some more comments on what Theo has been mentioning. Maybe just an idea of timelines. I know how possible is it to put specific timelines on these processes if those pilot projects are undergoing, if it's happening right now. What can we realistically see happening within the next 6 to 12 months? If that's a Band-Aid, will that Band-Aid stay there for a while? And what can happen moving forward?
Look, it depends. I think, we've had the Energy Action Plan, okay, and it's taken probably a few months to get momentum. Policy change can often come with quite a bit of inertia at the start, but you're starting to see some changes, okay. And I think ultimately what you've got to look at is, if you or I wanted to put solar PV on our own roofs, well, you can have that on in a week. Yeah. Okay. To be fair, when you build the projects that we typically are looking to build, which is the sort of 100 megawatt to 200 megawatt projects, you're talking about a probably 2-year process. Okay. In terms of permitting, funding, and connecting to the grid. But typically, I would say those are happening, in the national programs. Okay. I would agree around the, and as I said, maybe because we come from two different sides. I'm probably always wanting to say, how do I get the existing stakeholders to collaborate in a better way, understanding, because I think that becomes the key issue, is it if we can understand what the impacts are for each sector, but what they need, okay, to essentially manage it, then first you can say, right, what can I do with the existing, let's say, we have an energy shortfall, and we all know that we probably need to build new generation. And it's getting that mix right. I think for I or any other individual, essentially taking yourself off of the grid, as people love to talk about it these days, is great, but it actually you don't want to actually lose people from the grid. Okay, you actually want to make your customer a participant in the grid, so that if you have extra energy, you can put that into the grid. But as I say, key things, I think, from my perspective, it's like we do stuff with the mines. We say, right, let's understand your load profile. Okay, you're trying to essentially replicate an ESCOM energy supply solution. Okay, with a PPA, for example. Okay. Typically, you can't do that through one technology. You probably need to look at, and that's when people talk about going off the grid. I say, no, don't talk about going off the grid. But in many cases, I say, many of your bigger farmers certainly already have generators. So the question is, how do I essentially integrate, okay, my diesel jennies with, say, solar PV, okay, so that essentially it brings my diesel bill down on a monthly basis to one that's more manageable as it comes into your input costs. For example, I've heard like fertilizer costs have gone up like 100% over the last year. Now the question is, how much of that is due to energy input into the production? And as I say, it finds its way into your business probably in ways that you don't actually realize sometimes. Okay, because you might look at what's coming through the plug, but actually those energy increases that are coming in from tomorrow, okay, are impacting every part of your value chain.
Let's bring the conversation maybe down just a little bit in terms of new entrants. New entrants to farming, people who have just started in the industry, the total newbies. Where does this leave them? Where does this ongoing process leave them? What should they be thinking about? And also maybe talk about whether they're in a better position to start with this green energy options, farming off the grid. Should they just be thinking about that from day one? Theo, maybe you can talk first and then I'll give Mike a chance.
Yeah, maybe, I'd also be curious to hear what Mike says about this, but I think one of the challenges, one of the things that came out quite clearly when we did the study, and there was around 500 agribusinesses and producers that participated in the study, is you're asking, what are the actual costs of load shedding to you at the moment? And the direct cost of diesel, obviously that's an easy one to calculate. The more difficult one, but this came through very, very clearly, is there are millions and millions and millions of rands that would have gone to expansion, that would have gone to creating jobs, that would have gone to expanding production, that's now going to future-proofing business, mostly for energy. Now existing businesses, it's obviously not a decision that you want to make, but it's a decision. But at least, to some extent, they might have the balance sheet, they might have the history, the capital to be able to do that. For new entrants, I think it'll be very, very tough. If you don't have if you're a new entrant and you don't have that established balance sheet, I think it will be so much more difficult to do so. Again, it also completely depends on the type of farming enterprise. For instance, if you are a new entrant and you're going into, you're setting up a broiler house with chickens, energy security is so vital. There's no way you can go without it. You have to factor that into your costs, having some sort of backup generation capacity. Because if the power goes out for even a couple of hours, you're going to have catastrophic, real bad consequences. So I think it's a tough one. It's probably one that I would think for, there might be opportunities. I'd be interested, to hear if there are opportunities, but I think there definitely is adds an additional sort of barrier to entry, if I can put it that way, for new entrants.
Mike, your take on it?
Being a non-farmer, or let's be honest, or rather be clear, I farmed for 2 years and it was so bad. But other side of the world, actually. Okay. It was in Hungary. Right? I tried farming for 2 years in Hungary, and I said no thanks. It's for me, I think it's a challenging sector to be in, particularly if you're a small farmer coming into it. One of the things I always like to say that as a farmer, you are exposed to so many things that can essentially destroy the economics of your business. And so I said, because the Department of Agriculture is often one of our, as a solar PV developer, is often one of our biggest challenges of getting them to allow us to build on land. And I always say, well, listen, actually, solar PV is just like farming the sun, okay? But actually, it's probably one of the crops that has probably one of the most predictable revenue flows. Okay, so for you black farmers, I often thought, well, in a developmental economy, how do you try and remove some of the risk? Okay, and if you have a business where at least you could say, okay, there's a certain percentage that I know I've got a pretty good confidence level of revenue, whether it rains or hails or whatever, or if there's a drought. Okay, that gives a good base to the business. Okay, and look, I think I say, we might get over. We will get over the energy crisis over the next, I think, 5 to 10 years. But I think it wouldn't surprise me. Well, water will be a problem within that space. So again, for new farmers, there's a whole different sort of set of challenges facing them too. Even when I met with some of the farmers that are on huge, they're facing challenges. But the one thing I would say I've always understood about the agricultural sector, and I would say when I used to work for a bank, I was head of the agricultural sector, so I've met with farmers in South Africa, in the past. It is one of the most innovative sectors. It is one of the sectors that seems to adopt new technologies. Okay, probably in a far more open way to say than the mining sector or other sectors. So I think the technology is there, okay, to make farming sustainable. Okay, how new entrants come into it it's going to require a lot more support. But for a developmental economy, it's a sector that you clearly want to encourage new people into, I get it. I'm very involved in the just energy transition. And one of the things I often say to government, why is it that it always has to be the energy sector that has a just transition? I say, where's the just agricultural transition? Where's the just transportation transition? Okay, and the purpose going forward is if someone is interested in farming, okay, how do you essentially make it accessible for them? Okay, so I think that's probably the only thing I could probably intelligently say about that. As I say, with my success rate in farming being absolutely zero.
Bring you here to talk about that. We came for the energy discussion, so we're good. Don't worry.
One thing I can maybe ask, it came to mind now. It's not my own sort of knowledge, but when I was speaking to one of the engineers from the agribusinesses assisting us on this task team, he was actually saying when they designed for that sort of that agribusiness. Their renewable energy solutions, the very first starting place, as you said, you have to go through measuring your consumption as accurately as you can and go through, with a fine-tooth comb, go through every single aspect and see where you can reduce your consumption before you think about going sort of renewable. So I suppose one advantage with a new entrant is from the start, you can try to the extent that it's possible, design your enterprise to be as energy efficient as possible.
No, that's definitely.
Look, energy efficiency is always, I think, the area we don't focus on enough in South Africa. I remember when we had the sort of the first bout of load shedding in 2007, 2008, and all the intensive energy users sort of entered into an agreement with government on that original kind of curtailment of 10% to help load shedding. What you found was most of the intensive energy users found, and I think on average, they were able to save 13% of their energy consumption just by doing things slightly differently. Okay, so I think historically, remember, we've always had very cheap electricity tariffs in South Africa, but that's often meant that we haven't used it in the most efficient way. Okay, in many cases, if you don't really know the cost as a consumer on you, if you can't measure your usage, it's often very difficult to become efficient. And it's one of those, unfortunately, new phenomena of people who put solar PV up, all right, and you're looking at your app. all the time to look at your energy consumption, all right, and what are your panels putting out and things like that. Remember, most people can't see that, okay? And the first thing is to be able to, if you want to be efficient, you need to be able to measure your energy consumption.
Let's talk a little bit about this technology that you obviously know about and you can share with everyone who's listening. What are some of the small wins and what are some of the options available to farmers? What are the alternatives? And I specifically want to talk about the costs because that's a big thing. let's not tell them that it's possible and it's not possible. And what are the options that they can be exploring? Mike, I think I can give this one.
I mean, look, one of the things I think that's always one of the challenges of when you want to put renewable energy down, okay, is the capital cost. Okay, your capital cost is all up front, okay, because your let's say your primary energy is zero in terms of relying on the sun, okay, and it tends to have low maintenance, but big capex up front. I would say, and I checked my numbers because we tend to build bigger ones, which is more cost efficient, and we'll talk more about where that becomes relevant, I think, for the industry going forward. See, typically, I would say you've got to look between 12 to 15 million rand per megawatt installed for a ground-mounted project, say between 1 and 5 megawatts. Okay. Ultimately, you've got to understand that you're putting down something that will have essentially probably at least 25, probably more like 30 years of economic life. So you'll typically find the sort of cost over the full life of it is going to be certainly even now going to look competitive compared to Eskom's price, but that's not including battery. And I think that's often the when you start doing the rands and cents. Okay, when you have to start adding battery to meet that load profile, depending on what sector you're in, when you need power, your capacity to move. As I said, that's what the mining sector found. The capacity to move some of your operations to certain parts of the day. If you can do it all during the time that you're listening to us, for example. Okay, you may suddenly find the economics change. But, sometimes it's difficult to tell nature what to do, right? But, the costs are coming down all the time. And ultimately, it's a decision that, if you're a large enterprise, may be easier to make. I know some of those farmers are very used to making big capex decisions. I think for smaller groups of farmers and cooperatives is if they can find ways of essentially clubbing together to find a way of solving their energy. And the other part of it needs to be a recognition, I think, by government that it is a critical sector. Okay, and there needs to be that support. Okay. To some extent, you may say it's part of the just energy transition by making these sectors accessible, and the skills training accessible for people to move into this new types of farming. And so, particularly when you're now having to start very carefully thinking about water scarcity. Okay, how do I farm more efficiently? I think those big pivots waste a lot of water now. But ultimately, it's going to be about new types of farming. Okay, it's about that forward-looking farming. Okay, the other thing that was always interesting, and this is a story from the days I was in coal mining, and we were owners of a mine outside Carolina, and it was open cast. So what would happen is you take away all the soil, okay, take the coal out, and then you'd re-soil. And we had a very innovative CEO of the mining company. And I think everyone in that area and their father and grandfather had grown maize. But he went off and found this agronomist to sort of say, what alternative crops could I grow, okay, that would be of higher value? And for some reason, he found that actually you could grow strawberries because everyone these days wants strawberries every day of the year. And there's a period apparently between October and November where in this area you can grow strawberries. But because and you have to grow it under tunnels, but it's highly job intensive because you have to hand pick. Okay, and we ended up talking to the largest strawberry farmer in the world in Scotland. To set something up. So as I say, I think if we can apply innovative thinking to it, maybe there are other crops and higher value crops other than what we're doing, as long as it doesn't affect food security, But that's just me being. That's me as a non-farmer talking about farming. So maybe be careful.
I think it's relevant, and I think a lot of what the conversations that I've had with many farmers, they are future focused. They want to look at what the alternatives are. They want to make sure that the next generation can farm, maybe not in the same way, but better. So I think there's definitely. I had an interesting conversation around, alternative protein, more honeyworms, all of these other things that we could be doing. That's not now.
But also immediately say something like solar pumps. I would say on some of those where you have to pump consistently.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think you find that maybe your pumping costs.
Yeah.
Okay. And those may be things that you can sort of in terms of short wins.
Yes.
Okay. But firstly, the ability to do an energy audit, to understand as a business, when you have, if you look at, for example, deep level mining, the contribution of electricity to deep level mining rose from something like 4% in 2003 to now 29%. Okay, that fundamentally changes the economics. Okay, it's particularly if you either have to pass that on to the customer. Okay, you either have to reduce your own costs, and that often means retrenchment. Okay, or it puts you out of business. Okay, so one of the problems I think of this, the way now we're going to probably go through a period of higher than CPI tariff increases, is the capacity for these businesses, and particularly how electricity feeds indirectly into your business, is can we produce food that's affordable? Okay, all right, because that's often the key thing. It's not so much about what's the cost of generation, it's what's the cost of delivering that megawatt, okay, to a business, okay, that's got to produce food, that's actually got to produce water, that's actually got to produce fertilizer, okay, and can the market stand that price increase?
Yeah. Theo, maybe just your take on this question specifically, and specifically around the task team and what you guys are thinking in terms of this,
Yeah, no, definitely. Maybe before I get to the task team, it was very interesting. I'm not an expert in these sort of things, but I had such an interesting, innovative idea the other day that a farmer came up with. Instead of battery storage, they were essentially pumping water and using that as storage. From a lower dam to a higher dam.
That's what Eskom does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, exactly.
And there's discussions that you can do that with deep level mines. Okay. By essentially, and there's gravity energy storage where you put essentially big blocks and you drop it down a long shaft.
Wow.
Okay. So these are happening elsewhere in the world. Okay.
I think maybe towards the end of the conversation, we'll talk about these best practices on a global scale and how we can possibly bring that home to our conversation. But yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if I can answer that, Dawn. So, like I mentioned, the two big areas that we focus on the task team was, the first one, obviously, emergency sort of measures to make it load shedding more predictable. The other aspect was obviously reducing the cost of business. Now, the diesel rebate, that was fortunately and thankfully announced by the Minister of Finance in the budget speech. A lot of work went into that. There are some challenges. The recent the specific rules regarding who qualifies, who doesn't qualify, the admin. I mean, those inputs are due tomorrow, actually, as it comes in next week. But there are some challenges because it doesn't take a whole value chain approach. It's very specifically focused on manufacturing for human consumption. So the whole value chain, animal feeds, these things might be excluded. So those are some of the challenges. Looking at what was announced specifically, the rebates, etc., for both for diesel as well as the solar rebates, I think it's positive. But the challenge are those is not going to address cash flow constraints. It's something you claim back against your tax if you're making a profit, and it's something that obviously the benefit is delayed. So really the affordability challenge from the start, if you don't have that capex, especially as a new entrant, that's a huge challenge. So the thing that not just the agricultural sector, but I think the banking sector is also looking at is something similar to what we had with the COVID bounce back scheme, a type of macro blended finance mechanism. I know the Department of Agriculture, and we've also been in discussions there. Obviously, it's an internal governmental thing to see how much budget and where they get the budget from. But specifically for the smaller producers who don't necessarily have the capex, who don't have the balance sheet to borrow necessarily, the money to install their capex in the short term, if they can't have a blended finance scheme specifically dedicated for that to help smallholder farmers. And I think it is a good idea. We do have the existing blended finance scheme with the IDC and Land Bank for transformation, and hopefully it will be extended to the commercial banks. So there are some discussions taking place, hopefully to create a niche product within that framework specifically for renewable energy. So we hope that'll come to fruition. But of course, it's got a big fiscal implication for government, and that's something that on a high level they'll have to sort out.
Look, I would say, and you're seeing it start to come into the residential solar sector, is you're seeing companies now offering solar leases. Okay, so ultimately, instead of you having to own, okay, the infrastructure, okay, you can lease the infrastructure, and it's at early stage. I think, look, which we call it, let's say, asset-based financing, has been here for many years in terms of vehicle finance. Okay, as long as there's a residual value, okay, on your, typically you can find ways, I think, that can reduce that cost, okay, to businesses and to farmers. I think we just need to get, often I find in South Africa, and being an ex-banker, you kind of have to get to a crisis, okay, to get banks to kind of focus on this. 2 years ago, if you'd gone to most of the banks, say, why don't you offer solar loans for houses? Because surely you're putting your householder in a far more secure position, because now his electricity costs going forward, her electricity costs going forward, are far more predictable. So that puts from a credit perspective, it puts your essentially customer in a far more, in a far better position. Okay, now but you needed a crisis, and often that's unfortunately for me, that's often the problem in South Africa. We often only move when we have a crisis.
And then the disaster, we do something.
Right. So, and to go back to what you said, now we've changed legislation. So, any farmer can put up, his own solar behind the meter and sell. But typically you want that to happen and allow the market to come in by design rather than by default. Because often you find when markets develop by default, you don't think through the whole system and the implications it can have. And, I've said recently to a number of people, in South Africa, we often hope the market does things for the right reasons. Typically, that's not the way markets work. Okay, so I've always said, listen, with the market, the best for, and this is, I've been in competitive markets for probably 30 years. We don't have a conscience, we have a nervous system. So what you must do is, you don't have to trust us, and the market never wants to be trusted, but you must give it the right stimulus of pain and to do the right thing. Okay, and so I think one of the things you must think through, and this is, I think, and let's say probably more for Theo when he's sitting in that task team, is are we putting in place programs that gets the market do what we want it to do for us? Okay, and maybe you sometimes have to sort of understand the market from, say it does have some perverse thinking.
Any response to that, Theo?
No, it's sound advice, and luckily I've got Mike's cell number, so I'll push on the button.
I think we've covered quite a bit as part of our discussion today, and we're nearing the end of our webinar. And thank you so much for everyone who's listening. We haven't forgotten about you. The discussion is going on, so thank you so much for tuning in. Everyone joining via the website, Food For Mzansi, via YouTube channel, via Facebook page. I hope that discussion so far has been good, and that you've been enjoying both Mike and Theo and the insight that they've shared. Let's talk just as we wrap up. You've answered it, but let's just recap again. Where should we be more efficient? And I think I want to come back to your opening lines about, how do we change the grid more practically, and just so that you can give us an idea of thinking around it as a start. And, is it more around bulk infrastructure? And you can talk on that. And what are the solutions going forward?
Yes, I think, as I said, what's happened in the past is we've been probably overly focused on generation and building generation. And you may say part of the problem we have today with the grid being so constrained is that many of those, it wasn't that Eskom transmission didn't actually plan to make the grid, enable the grid. It was just in many cases, budgets were essentially reallocated to Medupi and Kusile, okay, where the overspend came. And then you have this outcome, okay? So ultimately, you have to think as farmers. Everyone in business has to take a view on how long do I think this crisis is going to go on for. Okay, I think one of the problems of the state of disaster was what ends a state, what needs to happen so we can say we're at the end of the disaster, right? And so ultimately what that, the danger of it is this could go on for years and could then exacerbate other disasters like water, okay? And then we live in a state of disaster all the time, which is not the way we want to be. Essentially, spending money on the transmission grid is, that's a national jurisdiction, and that should be in those tariffs. Where it comes, I think to farmers, and particularly areas where you've got, essentially a collective of farmers, I think you need to think about how you work together. And as I said, knowing the way the cooperatives have tended to work in terms of understanding that, buying seed in bulk, essentially being able to get better finance for agricultural vehicles. The market is changing, that supplying energy is also something that may and can sit under that umbrella. And I saw, you say you're integrator, aggregator, and facilitator. Well, that's maybe the role that AGDA needs to look at of how you help farmers to do this. Okay, I think the other part is how do you integrate, and this is probably quite important, maybe from a longer term, medium to long term perspective, is even if we are the model climate change economy, okay, the reality of it is we are probably going to be inordinately affected by climate change, okay, than other countries. So ultimately it's about how do you build that resilience into energy, food and water security, okay, and we need to look at those practices. Okay, again, very much forward-looking practices, and how do we start moving reskilling and to those areas? And there are a whole, I think, there are a whole load of other technologies that we haven't even looked at properly here. Production of industrial heat and steam, okay, particularly in agri processing. If you go to Europe now, there are many technologies being developed that use renewable energy to create zero heat and steam, whereas in South Africa it's pretty much either ESCOM, coal or gas. So remember, as we go forward, particularly for our export, crops, we then have to start looking at carbon border adjustment mechanisms and how that may affect us. That's probably something we're not going to think about over the next couple of years. But what we also need to make sure is that we don't make panic short-term decisions that take us down a cul-de-sac, okay, that then doesn't allow us, okay, to do the right thing in the medium to long term.
Yeah. Theo, your final comments and thoughts around where we're going in the next few years?
No, absolutely. I mean, I like what Mike said about it takes a sort of a crisis to get some behavioural change. Water is exactly the same thing. I mean, we recently worked with the IFC for a water use efficiency study, and they said in the Western Cape, that was just after the Western Cape came out of sort of the 3-year drought. Most of the agribusinesses in the Western Cape were sort of miles ahead of the rest of the country with water use efficiency because they had a crisis. And when that goes into your planning and starts becoming part of your processes, I think for the long term, you'll see those efficiencies, and that's positive. I think it's exactly the same for energy. So, whether you're planning, whether we've got a crisis or not, I think the other aspect of it as well is energy prices are unlikely to come down. They're going to, carry on probably going up, both obviously liquid fuels as well as electricity. But so to be profitable in the long term, I think new businesses need to consider this, and existing businesses, to future-proof their businesses, also need to look quite critically at their consumption. That being said, I mean, look, energy consumption is not necessarily a bad thing. It's an indicator of development and progress. And I mean, if you look in the South African agricultural sector, where we've gone, doubling our production in value terms from 2010 to now has essentially been on the back of a lot of energy consumption, about the cold chain, about storage facilities that maybe other countries don't have. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but to work efficiently and to plan for that in the long term, I think that's probably the way forward.
Thank you so much to both of my guests. I think maybe before we wrap up, I did say that earlier that I wanted to, kind of figure out some of these best practices elsewhere in the world. And maybe, Mike, you can just wrap up with that last part. And then also just, I always like to ask people to encourage farmers, because I'm sure someone is going through load shedding at the moment. So just like that last comment as well. Thank you.
I'll go back to this idea going forward that ultimately we need going forward to look far more about how we integrate food, energy, and water security. And I already talked about it earlier. If you go to somewhere like Europe or China, the wide-scale use of agrivoltaics is something that I think we need to think about in South Africa. Okay, I think there are probably a couple of pilot projects, but I don't think we've moved it to the scale that Europe, and again, Europe's been forced because they just have so much competing land use issues. So go to Germany, go to the Netherlands, and you'll find hundreds of megawatts of this. If you go to China, you'll see gigawatts of this happening. And I think, you know, how we use that to be more water efficient, okay, and energy efficient. And as I say, being able to integrate those with food security is a key thing. I think many of these also enterprises have great ability to create jobs for small enterprises. You know, one of the other areas I'm involved in is in green hydrogen. And one of the things that I know green hydrogen is a very kind of like hot topic, it's been for the last few years. What we often forget is that, particularly for something like Sasol, if we want to create what we call P2X or green hydrocarbons, we need a compliant carbon source. Well, that's either from, let's call it fugitive CO2 streams from things like cement production, but in the main, it's going to be biomass. Okay, so one of the things that, you know, some of the farmers have recently said to me is, you know, when they have crop failure because of irrigation failure and load shedding, you know, the idea of there being an alternative, okay, industry, and whether that's through, you know, biomass production to supply, say, Sasol, or biochar for regenerative farming. There are those sectors that I think Europe are ahead of us on. And maybe sometimes I think we just, you know, I'm sure the farmers are far more ahead of on this than we are. But you need to look at those future industries and then say, well, what do I need from government to encourage, you know, us to go into these new sectors? Okay, I think many farmers have done it by themselves, and maybe the big farming enterprises essentially can do it. When you're trying to get smaller and newer players into that, I think the question is, how does government and the private sector collaborate, okay, to allow that to happen?
Thank you so much, Mike. Theo, maybe just your last and final message to people in your network, the farmers in your network, the commodity organizations, and everyone as we wrap up. Thanks.
Okay, no, thank you. I mean, I think, yeah, as I mentioned, sort of planning for the future and efficiencies is, you know, is probably the most important element. Maybe from a commercial point of view, maybe just, you know, in the short term, with the kind of work that we're trying to do with the task team from a national level, you know, the best that one can do through making inputs to disaster regulations, through everything we're doing, is to provide guidance on a national level so we can have certainty about the criteria, so we can share some best practices, some options. But ultimately, you know, the problem won't be solved at a national level. These sort of band-aid problems that we're talking about, it's going to be on a company level, it's going to be on a district level, because the infrastructure, technology is different in each area. So the communication, I think, is critical. But ultimately, I think the big message is just, if you want to ultimately responsible for your, you know, for your own energy security. So working in the local area, you know, with some partners, I think that's going to be absolutely vital going forward.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank both of my speakers for being here today. I'd like to thank all the technical team that's been assisting in the background. Thank you so much to everyone for engaging. Thank you so much to just you for being here and for allowing us to pick your brains for this time. I think we've covered a lot. I think we have a clear call to action. I think AGDA, as part of the work they're doing, they'll come back to you and they'll specifically talk about how they plan to take this conversation forward. From my side, everything of the best for your farming journeys, everything of the best with dealing with this energy crisis. And I think we have a clear call to action that was made here, and we hope that you will have enjoyed the discussion, and all the best. Thank you so much. Bye-bye for now.